past decade, Asia has taken a leading role globally in driving technology innovation. But if we're honest, things have gone a bit quiet since the pandemic, and the global recession has not helped things. But while things have gone quiet in Asia Pacific, that's not the case everywhere. In today's podcast, we're going to shift our geographic focus to where the action is, and that's the Middle East. Hardly a week goes by where there isn't another jaw-dropping announcement related to emerging technologies like AI, autonomous vehicles, or the Metaverse, or the massive investment in initiatives like Saudi Arabia's Neom. And to help us delve deeper into the Middle East technology innovation landscape, I'm joined by my good friend, Danial Mausoof. Based in Abu Dhabi, he also covers the Middle East and Africa as part of his job, so we're lucky to have him with us to share his unique insights and perspectives. Danial Mausoof, welcome to the TechBurst Asia podcast.
Thanks, Charles. Good to speak with you again.
It's too bad we're doing it remotely because we used to spend a lot of time together when you lived in Singapore, when you were working for Nokia in strategic marketing and market development across Asia Pacific and Japan. But that was many years ago, and then you bolted out. So what have you been up to?
Well, what's interesting is that we met in 2016, and we didn't meet in Singapore. We met in Vietnam at an analyst conference. And we talked about the other side of technology, which was about audio gear. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, I remember it. You cost me a lot of money after that conversation.
Yeah, I think you still will hold me to that. But that was what we ended up talking about. But you're right. We met some 7 or 8 years ago. And I was in Singapore. From there, I took off to London for a couple of years. I moved into a global role leading enterprise services for Nokia. At the time, immense learning, breaking into mining in Latin America, APAC, Middle East. It was exhausting, but exciting as well. And then from there on, I moved into the UAE about 2.5 years ago. I moved back to the service provider side, and I've been running a similar role on sales and solutions across Middle East and Africa.
It sounds like you've been keeping yourself quite busy, and it's kept us talking as well because I'm quite fascinated by everything that's going on in the Middle East. So the idea of today's podcast is I want to talk to you a bit about what you're doing now, but more just to do a deep dive on what's going on in the Middle East and how you would compare and contrast it to what we see here in Asia. So why don't we kick off? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the Middle East right now.
So the Middle East has been an interesting experience. I've been here for about 2.5 years now. If you were to draw parallels, I think there are some similar dynamics. Many countries, smaller countries, larger populations, some quite advanced in telco and some more on the emerging side. And really, Africa is just now coming up. We are literally opening markets such as Ethiopia, Angola, and others. And we're going to have 14 different licenses for 5G in the next 2 years. And I know you love 5G and you would love to talk about it. But in the Middle East, I think there is a lot of different dynamics happening. We have leaders such as UAE and Saudi, and you'll be surprised how driven they are to be cutting edge when it comes to telco as well as their digital transformation journey. UAE, of course, is up there with Qatar as well as Kuwait and others. And then we have the larger populace, which is Pakistan, Nigeria, and some of the other countries in Africa, which are just getting over the 4G hype cycle and starting to get themselves ready for 5G. So I think the dynamics are somewhat similar. But I think what MEA does well, they really want to promote themselves as leaders, especially Saudi, UAE, Qatar with their Digital Vision 2030. UAE has been very successful through COVID, and they've also taken advantages of some geopolitical shifts. As we've seen with the war in Ukraine, I think everyone would put their bets on the UAE. There has been some visionary leadership in the country, and they've been very clear in what they intend to achieve. I came here through COVID, and I can tell you it has been learning experience of how quickly and how well they managed that overall pandemic. So to summarize, I would say MEA spend and innovation focus is extremely high. They have markets which are lagging in Africa, and they can definitely learn from what's happening in this part of the world or the other part of the world. And of course, we do not see mass investments coming in Africa yet. So it's a very controlled rollout, even from a licensing standpoint, even from a technology trial standpoint. They're still assessing and making sure that there's enough for them to invest into the 5G hype cycle. I think that was summarizing some of the elements. One thing I would probably add, Charles, is there are certain negative narratives. One would be maybe myths to reality. I think there's a lot of initiatives in this part of the world. There is a lot of focus on innovation, but what gets delivered and what gets committed is something that is very much from the private sector. So there is a lot of investment and focus on what the private companies can build. The second part is 5G monetization. Even today in Saudi Arabia, you see about 20% 5G traffic uptake. So it needs a lot more. There are use cases which come in, and we can talk about that more. And I think the competition, UAE is open, but it is a small economy. Everyone wants to be here. It is a cultural hub. It breeds talent, but we still need to focus a lot on making sure that the right talent is in UAE, in Saudi, and you're able to develop that to make sure some of these elements take shape, because that's what's behind everything, is the people that are going to drive some of this innovation. So that's my observation in the last 2.5 years being in the region.
So I want to go back to the innovation and spend, but I think I want to first cover something you hit right at the end there, which was how do you actually support this locally? When you hear about a lot of the major projects in, whether it's in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or something like Neom in Saudi, what you end up seeing is tons of expats getting relocated out there, paid huge wages, and they don't have the skilled labor right now to actually support a lot of these initiatives. So do you think this is changing now? Do they recognize that they need to build up more local skills as well and not just always bring in the foreigners?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia is spot on driving this overall talent pool. If you talk to all the operators anywhere in GCC, you will see that there is a lot of focus on what companies like Nokia or even others in the tech can do to build the talent. So really there has been a focus on building learning platforms that allow you to engage. One leading operator in the UAE is working with us today to build their talent, make sure that not only their talent pool, even their executives are trying to understand how the talent build needs to happen on a technology standpoint, also on a leadership standpoint. So there is tons of projects that are being put into place for that. There is collaborations on a lab level, trying to do open labs as much as possible when it comes to advancing some of the technology. So there is mass initiatives. So the recognition is there for sure across the region that there needs to be a local pool of talent. And of course, they have done the government initiatives to make sure that there is enough local talent being developed. There is a mandatory regulatory behavior that allows people to hire local into certain jobs. And I think there is a big push for that.
When we talk about the innovation, we've mentioned 5G already, but it's not just that. What fascinates me is that every major headline now about some leading innovation initiative, whether it's around artificial intelligence, the metaverse, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, it all seems to be coming out of the Middle East. So what I'd like to do next is let's just give the audience a high-level breakdown of the top 3 markets. So let me know what your thoughts are on Saudi Arabia first, and maybe Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
Starting in the macro level, right? We talked a little bit about it. First, massive focus on transformation, digital transformation. There is so much happening. It is really hard to keep up with the government-led initiatives. I'll give you a personal example. I've been to LEAP, which is a big event, which looks like the GITEX in Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh. They have the Vision 2030 in Riyadh. If you go to this conference, the major purchasing happening in Saudi Arabia is the government itself. So it is a B2G event in some way, because the government is the one procuring. You've got massive presence from people like Neom, Autonomous, and others that are trying to look at what the private sector is there to sell and how they can innovate. They're doubling down on this transformation-led initiatives. GCC governments have doubled down on digital transformation across. As a core component of their respective 2030 plans, the UAE, Saudi, Kuwait have all launched initiatives. Bahrain, which is a very small country, has also recently announced plan to invest more than 30 billion or so across 20 projects in key industries. Qatar has an ongoing program that is looking to deploy solutions across priority sectors that they have set. And they, of course, will be hosting some of the bigger events in the region as we move forward. Now, if you look at Saudi Arabia specifically, they have had and charted a clear initiative around smart cities like Neom, or how they want to transform Riyadh with 2030. The focus is on investment powered on transformation, citizen-centric services, cloud, and of course, a big push on AI adoption as well. Saudi Arabia is really focused, Charles, on transforming their laws. They're promoting tourism, and there is a brute force changing the country. It is a young nation, by the way. That is what's different about Saudi today. In this region is it's a young nation, it's a large nation, and they have immense potential, which needs to be trained and, I guess, harnessed in a way that they could enjoy the talent that they have in that country. And then coming to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, through COVID, they have had a focus on citizen-centric services. Believe me, I have lived in the UK, in Singapore, and Singapore is, of course, a very advanced country. But when I moved here, I was amazed at the level of digitalization in this country. I'll give you an example, and nothing to do with what we're talking about. I went home to Sydney last year. It took me 2.5 hours to renew my driver's license. It takes me a minute to do it in the UAE. Literally a minute. You can time me for it. You really need to focus on the citizen services here, and you will find advancement across using artificial intelligence in traffic fines, in traffic violations, in all kinds of citizen services that are happening across the state are by Dubai and Abu Dhabi really cutting edge. It used to be a common thing people used to talk about. Walking out of the Singapore airport within 5 minutes was really critical for people who were traveling in and out. Dubai is no different. You just do it without a passport anymore because they're using AI at the immigration counters as well. So their focus is sharply on technology. They have also invested a lot on 5G. They have full coverage here, and coming up to 5G use cases, they've pushed a lot on the fixed wireless access here in UAE. And this is a use case that's really transforming some of the traffic patterns in 5G that we're seeing. And it's been an important area of development. The World Radio Conference is in Dubai this year, as is the COP28. So there is a lot of initiatives around some of the elements that come together in UAE. So really setting a platform rich of services that is all inspired by what the private sector and startups can do in the UAE. And then, of course, the smaller countries I spoke briefly about, Qatar, Kuwait, they're all holding very strong, not a follower position, rather even leading in some of the initiatives when it comes to transformation across the region. So summarizes some of the micro aspects as well, Charles.
What's really interesting for me is that when you look at what's going on with the US or with Europe right now, everyone's just talking about the impact of the recession. What I see going on a lot across Asia Pacific isn't so much the recession impact, but the impact of the policies of the MNCs. So all you see is the MNCs here aren't spending as much because they've got budget constraints, hiring freezes, travel bans. Yet when you look at the Middle East, they're spending, and you don't hear anything about the recession there. Is it even a topic?
Look, I think there are two elements to this. I think the first, of course, there is an impact in the region, right? Because if you talk about the startup space, the VC, whatever is happening in the US, whatever happened with SVB has an impact on the VCs. People are getting cautious. You're not getting as much investment in the VC circuit as you were possibly before. People are going to be a little bit more careful, and the investment cycle is slowing down and drying up. And on the corporate side of things, of course, global organizations are also scaling back. You have heard of cuts across the tech sector. That impacts the UAE as well. That impacts the Middle East overall. So it is being felt. On the other side, I think what is important is that there is a lot of commitment from the government to support as much as they can in terms of investment on the private sector and making sure that they're able to realize the vision that they have put together. So the elements of economy are well felt, but then maybe briefly, and I don't want to dive too much into it, though I would love to, is the geopolitics in the region. So you've got to understand how UAE is well positioned with where things are when what is happening around the world in Europe, when it comes to the geopolitics, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, or what's happening in this part of the world. Of course, UAE takes benefit from some of that. And there is a lot of people here now. I think in the last 2 years, we've seen a large influx of people. I was just reading an article a few weeks ago, the number of people that have moved here, the number of businesses that have been set up by foreigners in UAE has really significantly doubled. So there is a lot of investment coming in where people are more excited to be here. And one thing I would also add, and we could talk about this a little bit, is the regulatory focus in this country is second to none. When we talk about the fact that there is commitment, yes, there is commitment. But what UAE does well, and also Saudi does well, is that the regulatory advancement on particular areas such as AI, they're putting forward. So it might be that the technology is just ready for adoption, but there is a regulatory framework for people to work with it. That's what they did with fintech. When DIFC opened a few years ago, when fintech was booming, there was a regulatory framework for people to speak and work on through faster than other areas. I think that's an important element to enable people to come in and feel comfortable that there is support for them. There is a framework for them to follow.
All right, we're definitely going to come back to the regulatory side because I agree with you. It's one of the areas where the Middle East has really nailed it. Everybody else understands that we need to do something to regulate AI and that we need to put in policies and procedures if you want to go autonomous vehicles, whether they're taxis or flying vehicles. But they just seem to be getting on with it, whereas a lot of other countries are still basically dragging their heels. But first, what I want to do is go back a little bit to 5G. So you mentioned that it's easy to get good coverage now in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but those are relatively small-sized countries. But I'm presuming in Saudi, it's a much bigger challenge because I actually wanted to see how big is Saudi Arabia. And it's equivalent to the size of the U.S. east of the Mississippi. So it's probably about as big as half of the U.S. in that one country. So I'm guessing they still have a lot of coverage that's going to be required if they want to cover the entire country. But I'm guessing all the major metropolitan areas and thoroughfares are going to be covered quite well. Is that correct?
It is correct. In fact, it's not that they're covered. They're one of the best performing networks in the world. So again, it comes to the service providers like STC, Mobily, driving the vendors, including Nokia, to make sure that the network is top notch when it comes to performance. They're relentlessly pushing for performance. That means the consumer has the best possible connectivity across the country. Riyadh specifically is one of the best performing networks in the world. And with Mobily, for example, or STC would have better performing networks in other parts of Saudi. They're double downing their investment when it comes to 5G. They're using the technology at the best as they can in terms of their spectrum asset, using the carriers that they have on LTE to make sure that they've got the right capacity where they need to. Second, they have government specific infra projects. So they're running mission critical network projects in Saudi Arabia where they want to do an investment on making sure that there is mission critical networks in place. They're focused on tourism areas. As I said, Saudi wants to be a tourist destination. So they're focused on building areas in the north of Saudi Arabia where people can go, and they're investing 5G in those areas so they can get coverage and capacity to the tourist. Of course, they heavily invest on the Hajj areas, Makkah and Medina, to make sure that millions of pilgrims who come down have top-notch performance. This is a benchmark for people like us in the vendor world, may it be Nokia, may it be others. We take pride in what we do in Hajj because there is very few places in the world where that kind of an event happens once a year. So there is a mass amount of investment happening every year to make sure these aspects are done. Then there is a secondary element, which is their spectrum strategy. They're not holding back. They're going to be looking at 450 megahertz in the region. That means they would enable some of the enterprises like Aramco to have access to the spectrum where they could deploy private networks, which is also very cutting edge. Not many people are looking at that 450 as Saudi Arabia is. So the commitment to be first, commitment to be leading on 5G. And I would say Saudi Arabia is a country where the investment is starting to show some results, because when you talk about how they want to drive that user behavior is important. But if you start opening layers of spectrum for enterprise, driving some of the smart city initiative, you will see an incremental change on the monetization that is going to happen across the networks. But of course, that is all at the back of the fact that these are profitable operators. They're making the investment in 5G, and they're able to also transform towards their digitalization vision, which is very important in this region as well.
If they want to lead in some of the areas where they're focusing right now, whether it's artificial intelligence, the metaverse, autonomous vehicles, they're going to need very fast 5G, no latency to make these things actually work and be safe. So they need to invest in it. But what I like about it is it actually gives us someone we can watch right now to see how well are they going to do to monetize it. So this is the big game. Everybody across Asia has been struggling, with the exception of China, to monetize 5G. They've launched it, deployed it. They never had the use cases. But what we see in the Middle East is fixed wireless access has done well. All those other things really be successful without really good 5G. So do you think they're going to be the ones leading on how to monetize 5G?
Yeah, I think 5G is a contributor to many facts of what transformation does, right? So if you step away from 5G itself only, the public cloud spending in GCC is rising. I think it's doubling in the coming years, probably talking $1 billion in 2020, maybe $2.5 billion in 2024. All the web scalers, AWS, Microsoft, all of them are very active. They have open regions in this area. So there's a lot of focus on that. So there is a cloudification element in telco, which is also at play, right? We can, again, talk about some of the elements that are disrupting the telco industry, the age-old telco industry, that we could talk about maybe in another podcast. But I think there is an element of what cloud is going to be doing overall in telco as well. Then, of course, AI. How do you drive investment into overall? I think that just in GCC, we're looking at mass amount of focus on AI, not just in specific private sector, but even the government initiatives are very much focused on AI, as we talked about. And then the final enabler will be smart cities, or even if you can call these cities smart cities, because these are cities built from scratch. They're not smart cities. They're just cities which are coming in like Neom or Line. And when you talk to Neom and how they want to build, they're literally focused on building a city for 9 million people and their future cities. So everything around them is built around connectivity. So fiber, satellite, 5G all play a massive role in what these cities are going to look like. So I think all of those enablers will allow the use cases to come in. But the fundamental of that is having a solid foundation of best performing networks. And there is no giving up on that from the operators in this region, as well as the government.
You did a good lead in there, because the next two areas I want to cover are going to be AI and smart cities. So let's go at AI first. You mentioned the investment that's going in right now, but it's also the education, trying to create that next generation of employees. We're seeing some new AI research centers across the UAE. We see so many amazing announcements. How much of that is real right now, or is it just marketing and show that we're the leading on innovation?
Look, I think there's a bit of both, right? I think marketing and setting a vision is a fundamental way of making people believe in the narrative. And I think they do a good job here. And it has an impact. It draws people in. It draws talent in. It draws startups in. It draws people in to believe that UAE is the right incubation ground for doing these things. So I think it does what it needs to. But of course, there is a lot of initiatives. And as I said earlier on, the private sector is driving this. So there is an appetite and the vision is there as well. Now, how does it turn out? We have to keep an eye on this in the next couple of years. I think the framework is there. The regulatory framework is there. The vision is there. And honestly, the technology is there. So we need to make sure that we are seeing these things through with the right amount of investment coming from both the private and the government to see some of these aspects come to reality. They're well baked into the 2030 vision. They want to see that. And we want to make sure that there is something that's coming together, not just for the UAE, but more from a regional perspective as well. And the collaborative aspect that are coming in from some of the private and public partnerships are also fantastic in this region. So we have to see how it all tails out in the next couple of years. But there is a lot of focus on this.
All right. So we've been talking at more of the high level. How about some cool initiatives or programs that you've seen across the region that you can talk about to say this is really how they're actually applying it? It isn't just theoretical. Here's some of the cool stuff that they're doing.
Look, I think there has been a lot of investment and talk about what in Saudi Arabia, what Neom is doing, right? And I think if you look at the overall market in Saudi Arabia, there has been a lot of focus on AI and Metaverse. So there are elements of industry Metaverse coming into play. I know this is a bit of a word that you think about it and you're like, okay, we just started talking about Metaverse and now we're breaking this down. But I think
It's probably my most hated buzzword, by the
private.
way, the industrial metaverse. It
Yeah.
just makes me cringe. It's
Yeah.
basically a digital twin, but we haven't bothered to explain
It
to
is.
people what a digital twin is.
Yeah.
Now, if we just rename it as the industrial metaverse, people will magically understand what it is.
But isn't that what we do always? Every hype cycle, we end up doing this. And it's hard to explain why things don't take off and then you reframe them into something different to explain it slightly differently. And that's what's happening in this part of the world or everywhere actually with the metaverse. I cannot keep up with the metaverse initiatives that are there in the region or globally. But there is a lot of digital twin or industrial metaverse aspect coming in. And what I really like about these initiatives are, if you look at the private sector, if you look at how you could use some of this in industries such as mining or oil and gas, those are the initiatives that are really going to make these use cases work. They're going to be small, but us as Nokia, we're trying to do some of the projects where we're looking at working with the likes of the big oil and gas sector in Saudi Arabia to see what use cases we could do in this digital twin industrial metaverse area. So there's a lot of smaller initiatives that we're focused on as an industry to drive these outcomes. Maybe they're not public initiatives, but those are happening in the larger private oil and gas sector or the mining sector. So that's an interesting area. Then if you come to the government, I think AI is playing a role. Many aspects of AI in the UAE are being put out. There are some citizen specific services that are being announced. There has been a lot of focus on some of the projects around the pilgrim that I talked about earlier for the Hajj and Umrah, which is going to be around some technology being used for people trying to virtually visit the religious pilgrim by not being there. Actually, a friend of mine was involved in a project where they were providing this virtual visit to people who wanted to visit from Pakistan, for example. So I think a lot of these initiatives are happening in the region, small scale, not something that you can say are going to be monetized easily. But I think we'll watch and learn as it happens.
I know places like Dubai say they plan to turn themselves into one of the top 10 global leaders for the metaverse. So I don't know how they're going to rank that, but there'll be some firm, I'm sure, will try to monetize the ranking of leaders in the metaverse. Now, let's go back into the smart cities because we've brought up Neom on a few occasions. And let's just put this with a bit of perspective. So Neom, the project itself, is somewhere in the region of $500 billion of investment to create things like the line, which is going to be more residential commercial, but also Trojena, which is going to be their tourism area we were talking about up in the north. This is massive amounts of money going into that. To put it in perspective, Songdo, which was also a greenfield smart city in Korea, which was beautiful when it came out, that was only $35 billion. So now we're looking at 15-fold much more. And I'm sure that's going to go well above the $500 billion. This is fascinating. And they are pulling in some of the world's leading people in smart cities because there's so much to be done. But what's your take? Like, how well do you think Neom is going to do? And how much can they actually achieve of their objectives?
Look, I think Neom, if I step back and the way we engage with Neom today, Neom, from a vision standpoint, you can't fault it, what they want to do. It's a truly the world's first sustainable city, right? It's going to be ground up, everything from scratch. What we see is going to be built from a very citizen-centric point of view. Now, is there investment in Neom? Absolutely. And there is enough commitment from the Saudi government to make sure that Neom is a reality. If you look at engaging on the network build today, there is a lot of projects. And recently I met somebody in Neom who was explaining to me that they have a target to test everything that they can to make sure that the city or the networks that they build for the future city are well tested in trials. Anything from any type of satellite services to 5G to fiber to IP, optics, everything is being invested in from a trial perspective. So I see really this appetite for making sure that the right technology is taken to market in Neom. So from that point of view, I also think that there is a tremendous opportunity. But the part that I struggle with maybe a little bit is how quickly are they able to realize the potential of that city given where it is and how they want to bring people to that city. There has to be something that is, you build a network to build the city, but then you also are building the network for the citizens there. And that's something that they focus on. I believe it's 9 million or so that the city residents will be in Neom. So that's the challenge. How do we make sure that the city becomes attractive enough for people to be part of that ecosystem when it is built? But when it comes to commitment, technology, advancement, and trialing what needs to be done, I think Neom really is driving a lot of the activity in the region, Charles. There are so many people, so many companies working with Neom right now to make
everybody is working with Neom. Every consulting firm, every tech vendor, every VC is trying to get in there. It's staggering the amount of engagement they have right now. But what I get asked quite a bit by some of my clients, and what do you think about Neom? Will it ever live up to all the hype? And I just say, I don't care. If they can deliver 10% of what they're promising, they'll be the most innovative city ever. And it's at 10%. Yeah. What will happen along the way is they will drive innovation because they're going to test all these things, like you mentioned, but they're going to try and apply them in real life scenarios before anybody else. So they are single-handedly going to be really driving a lot of technology, emerging technology innovation over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's what I like about it, because there's not many places that have that deep of pockets who can really focus on it. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of cities would love to have even $5 billion to spend on their smart city initiatives. You're talking about $500 billion at a minimum, and that doesn't count the money that some of the public sector will put in as well. So I just think it's one of these areas where we have to watch it, because even if they only deliver 10% on what they're promising, it's going to be amazing.
Absolutely. I think that's where, and I can tell you, working with the Neom right now a little bit of what they want to achieve, they are really driving the right technology requirements to make sure that they have an assessment of what is the right thing to do. From a telco perspective, when somebody comes in and you want a city without a single tower, telco tower, that itself is a very important milestone from anything. And that's how Neom is going to be. It's going to be a small cell paradise, let's say.
That's nice, because where I live in Singapore, they've replaced 3 towers down here next to my building. And they tried to make them look like palm trees, but instead what they look like is giant pipe cleaners. So everyone's been on social media calling them the new pipe cleaners. Okay, but now another area that the Middle East is definitely going to be the leader is autonomous vehicles. And that's just because they're so far ahead on investment, but also, like you mentioned earlier, on the regulatory side. And there's a lot of headlines coming on. I mean, in Dubai, they're talking about the autonomous taxis coming out very soon. There was just the release of the new concept design for its Veloport for eVTOLs, which is one of my most hated acronyms in the world. It's for electric vertical takeoff and landing airplanes. So they've got the concept design, and that might actually be put right next to the Dubai airport. But it's fascinating because they are out there pushing autonomous vehicles ahead of everybody else. And a lot of that comes down to the regulatory. And I'm really impressed about the amount of work that they've put into this, because some other places aren't really doing it. So what's your take about autonomous vehicles in the Middle East?
Look, you already said it, Charles. The UAE standards are already there. They have been putting technical and safety requirements to ensure consumer safety as early as 2020, I believe, or 2021, where they talked about how they prepare the infrastructure to make sure that we've got the right safety requirements in place. They have been doing a lot of push on testing these vehicles. The UAE government approved self-driving vehicle usage again in 2022. When the expo was happening here a year and a half ago, there was a lot of focus on driving some of the specific autonomous vehicles, reports and tests that were happening around the expo. So there has been a commitment on the regulatory side 2 years ago. So now there has been immense amount of focus. There is a lot of trials happening in the UAE. Like I said, once you have the regulatory framework in place, there is an immense amount of opportunity that comes with it. And this is something that it was very early on. You would not find the structure as the UAE has put in to make sure that they're able to provide a sustainable mobility feature for these autonomous vehicles. So it's an interesting space to watch out, honestly.
One of the places that I thought would lead in this is Australia, because they have a lot of highly trafficked routes by helicopters where they could just try to take that over for the eVTOLs. But it hasn't really come into fruition because of a combination of lack of regulatory, but then also the citizens tend to not trusting the government to put these things in place. I know they were looking at doing an autonomous helicopter to fly from Darwin to one of the national parks. I know there's some demand for going between Newcastle down to Sydney, but the most highly trafficked helicopter route in the world is actually Melbourne CBD out to its airport. They just haven't been able to get over that regulatory hurdle. That's why I'm so interested in seeing how this is going to play out in the Middle East, because everybody else can learn from it. And if they're taking the time to write those regulations, we should be learning from them instead of starting from scratch.
Yeah, and it's part of the 2030 vision of Dubai as well, to make sure that they've got a number of focus initiatives on public transport. I think the RTA, the Road and Transport Authority here, has been pushing a lot of news around what they believe should be the number of taxis on the road by 2030 when it comes to autonomous vehicles. So yeah, they've got a commitment to have a fleet in place. And that's something that we need to continue to watch. And this is a very largely tourist-driven economy. So people have an appetite to use these services more than other places. We didn't talk much about retail here, but the amount of services that are offered here on apps is also second to none. Careem, of course, just launched a super app. So you can pretty much get anything, anywhere within the super app, or you can talk multiple retail apps that are around. So people are very service dependent, if I can use that word, on how they access technology. Because part of the story on any of this is how quickly will people adopt to these things? And I think UAE, of course, is one of the areas where you see a lot of this coming in due to the people that are here, the type of people that come into the country are very much focused on having that services benefit.
On the investment side, the Middle East is sorted. Everyone's pretty cash rich right now, but they're looking to transition away from oil into new services. The regulatory side, demand we'll have to see. My big concern is on the supply side. So are there enough tech vendors and also enough highly skilled workers there today to really drive and support this innovation? Or is it just going to be delivered by expats?
Yeah, look, I think there is definitely an intent to move away from oil. The reality is oil is here to stay for now, right? So I think that transition is well ahead of the curve. They're already trying to move away from oil dependency, and they still have a lot of flow to deal with. So I think that's a good thing in a way where you are, if you have the vision, the determination to create what we see here, you can make it happen. The challenges, I think they remain, right? We have to be very honest with ourselves. This is a small region. We have to have the right talent pipeline. We have to have commitment to innovation. It needs to stay resilient, and it needs to stay where it is today, ahead of others with that vision, and make sure that's ultimately what's driving it. But talent will play a very important part. And finally, again, this is probably another stream of discussions, is regional stability needs to continue. We are in a very complex, dynamic geopolitical frame in the world today. And this regional stability plays a big role in where these markets are going to be. So that has to be an important factor as well. If we summarize it, as you were saying, a big factor here is the vision, the determination of the government. It is the regulatory frameworks that are coming into play, and allowing people to invest in the right areas will continue to drive and shape up the economy here. The supply part, like I said, it remains a little bit of a challenge because the scale might not be there yet in certain areas. It's there in telco for sure, but there are other areas where the scale won't be there. The number of AI-focused startups here isn't very high. It's mostly focused still in China and the US. And this part of the world, of course, really reaps the benefit of that, but does not have a lot of that ecosystem today. So we've had successes in this region, such as Careem, but there has to be a lot more of that to happen for it to get that scale. So scale is going to take time and is a factor of supply, which will also come in smaller doses now, and we just have to watch and see and incubate as much as possible to continue to get people interested in this part of the world and make sure that that investment doesn't dry out and make sure that we've got the right talent in place as well.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. Now we're going to try and summarize it. Let's just say, when do we think it's going to be ready for adoption across the Middle East? Is that going to be near term, medium term, longer term? So easy one, you're the expert, 5G.
I think Middle East is starting to see use cases. It has some ways to go, but I think the adoption is happening. I think it'll take longer in Africa. Middle East, I think we're there. I think we're going to see more and more of this coming in.
I think the 5G networks across the Middle East are good. I think Africa is going to take a while. I agree with you completely. What about 5G monetization?
Yeah, look, I think for me, fixed wireless access, it's an important one that's driving some of this. But I think we talked about this, autonomous vehicles, gaming, AR, VR, all of this will drive together given the ecosystem that we talked about, cloudification. We talked about smart cities. We talked about some of the other initiatives that we have. I think that'll all drive this monetization. We're not there. I agree. I think we need to continue to drive that, not just in the telco industry across, because ultimately connectivity is the foundation of all things that we're talking about.
And I would agree. I think it's a medium-term one, but I'm very bullish that they will be able to monetize before most of the other developed markets in Europe and the US, just because of the users and the use cases that would actually support these different countries in the Middle East. I do think Africa will struggle with 5G monetization because they won't have those use cases. It's primarily a consumer play. So until the enterprise sector comes in, there's going to be a challenge. Next topic, artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Look, I think in terms of use cases, this part of the world is going to be driving a lot of the use cases that comes from AI. So I think we definitely have enough use cases for artificial intelligence here. There's a lot of investment. So they will be consumers of technology faster in this region than maybe others, just because of the layout of the way the GCC countries are. So there is high GDP countries, they're able to spend more on citizen services, the citizens are able to consume more. So AI will play a big role in people's lives here sooner rather than later. In terms of investment, in terms of AI specific startups and ecosystem, that's going to take time. And for the sake of not repeating myself, that requires what we discussed earlier in terms of talent, scale, supply, all of those things will play a factor. But use cases, consuming AI, I think we're going to be ahead from many.
And I would agree. And I think a lot of that also goes back to the governments like Dubai, where all citizen services were digitized and they're leveraging AI already. Next one's going to be a bit of a little twist for you. What about large language models like ChatGPT?
I don't know how far we're going to get away from these things, right? So now I'm one of those technology believers that I think you need to adopt and regulate and make sure that we're using this for the right. So for me, ChatGPT, all language models now are becoming a reality. So the sooner we're able to take these into account and use them for the right purpose, I think the better it is for us as individuals or as humans to take advantage of the technology. I think people are getting very excited about it, which is good. But at the same time, I think we need to also rationalize what it is that we can get out of this or in the long term. So I can't comment on how quickly the region will adopt to this. I think this is a global topic. I think it's going to be pervasive everywhere in the same way because it's very consumer driven today.
It's going to be fascinating to watch this evolve. But you're right. We need to figure out how we're going to regulate it. But then it's how do we leverage it because it's not going away.
It's not. It's reality. It's a reality. And the sooner we get on it and understand how we use it to the best, I think that's where we need to focus.
Okay, next topic, one of my favorites, the metaverse, not the industrial metaverse. I'll let you include it if you'd like. How soon do you think we'll start seeing adoption of this?
Look, I personally, and this is not the view of Nokia or how we believe the metaverse will shape up. This is probably one area that I'm skeptical, to say the least, on how quickly these things will come in. Just as an individual and my interest in technology and how I see it, I don't see the use cases of metaverse really playing out. I'm not able to understand how some of these use cases will evolve. When talking about monetization, I really do not understand how the monetization will be in place for some of the metaverse. I will avoid getting into industrial metaverse because, again, I think there are specific use cases, but to me, this is long tail. We're talking maybe past 2030, maybe the next 10 years, unless I see something very specific. Might be completely wrong, happy to be corrected, but I'm not too bullish about this part.
This is almost like confirmation bias. I think we agree on all these topics. I also think medium to long term on this. My view is we don't know how to design and develop for it yet. We're still struggling with things as simple as AR. Yeah, we had Pokemon, but no one else has figured out how to integrate it into everyday life. Metaverse is a lot more complex than that. It's going to take time. Next one, smart cities.
Look, I think if you can classify cities in this part of the world as Neom and others, of course, these are going to be a big driver for what is happening. They are more short-term, I would say mid-term. In the next 3 to 5 years, we will see these initiatives really blow out. And when it comes to places like Qatar or Dubai or Abu Dhabi, they've got small projects today, which are super citizen-centric, and they're already driving. So the use cases, there's just going to be a massive amount of use cases coming in. I think, Charles, we were talking about this 10 years ago, but now maybe it's not as dramatic of a shift that we wanted in typical cities. But today, the number of use cases that are there, I think this is happening. This is now. It's just how do you create adoption for this?
And the final one, we probably don't even need to cover because we know self-driving taxis are going to be launching this year in Dubai, and the eVTOLs should be coming up shortly as well.
Yeah, I think this is watch and see. I think for here, it's how quickly do we as consumers start using these services. I think that's an interesting element of it.
Normally at this time, what I would be doing is saying, thank you for coming on and sharing your insights, and maybe you should come back again sometime. But Daniel, you're actually coming back again because we've decided to do a whole Middle East series, and you're going to jointly host those podcasts with me.
Absolutely. And I'm super excited. Very keen to continue to talk to some of our guests, which we will announce, and maybe dive into some of these topics that we talked about specifically and get more depth into what we're seeing in the region and what are the trends that we need to keep up with. So I appreciate the opportunity of doing this with you, Charles, since you're the pro here on podcasts. And if it leads to something, I would love to continue doing this. So super excited.
And I'm quite selfish, so I want to learn more about the Middle East, but I also really miss you living in Singapore. So this is a great way for us to keep in contact a bit more often. Daniel, thank you very much for joining the TechBurst Asia podcast.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the TechBurst Asia podcast. If you liked the episode, please do click like and subscribe. And if you didn't, well, you probably didn't make it this far anyway. Talk to you next time on the next episode of the TechBurst Asia podcast.